You know, it feels like every single time you open up the news, there's one region that is just always front and center. Yeah, the Middle East is trending. Doesn't matter if you're looking at today's news or news from 1948, 1973, 2003, it's always the same story.
And again.
Honestly, the whole region feels like that one chaotic group chat you're in where somebody's always kicking off, right? Someone's always starting drama, someone else is pointing fingers, and instead of angry emojis, well, you get the idea. But what if I told you this whole mess, this whole century-long argument, started with a pencil, a map, and two guys who basically said, yep, that's pretty much it. And that's the craziest part. The root of one of the most complicated, tangled conflicts in the world is kind of that simple. And that absurd. All right, let's get into it. So our story really kicks off right after World War I. You've got the massive Ottoman Empire, this thing that's ruled the region for hundreds of years, and it just collapses. It's like a giant rug being yanked out from under dozens of different groups of people. And into that chaos, that power vacuum, step two big players, Britain and France. And these guys, they cook up this secret deal, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I want you to picture this. Two diplomats sitting in a room, and they basically act like a couple of teenagers dividing up the last pizza. They just drew straight lines, across deserts, over mountains, right through ancient communities. They treated the entire region like it was a blank piece of paper, completely ignoring the millions of people who actually lived there. It was like geopolitics done by, drunk cartographers. And the fallout? Well, it was immediate, and it was catastrophic. You had entire tribes suddenly sliced in two, living in different, brand new countries. You had historical enemies, groups that had been fighting for centuries, now forced to share the same house inside the same borders. Religious groups were just thrown together like they were random, bickering roommates. The key takeaway here is this. From day one, you had a foundation of artificial, completely unstable states. Okay, so things are already a mess, but then a brand new ingredient gets tossed into this already explosive mix. Something that took these badly drawn maps and turned them into the most valuable real estate on the entire planet, oil. And man, it happened fast. First, it's discovered in Iran in 1908. Then boom, a huge find in Saudi Arabia in 38. After World War II, it's popping up in Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE. All of a sudden, these huge stretches of desert were sitting on the world's entire energy supply. So, just like that, the region goes from being a bunch of desert communities to becoming the world's gas station. I mean, it's the global ATM. And this fire hose of money, it creates wealth you can't even imagine. It completely shifts global power, and it makes controlling those artificial borders the #1 priority for, well, pretty much everyone. And yep, that is the exact moment when the rest of the world, especially the West, looks over and goes, nice oil you've got there. From that point on, local politics was never local again. It turned into this global reality show, with all the major powers constantly jumping in to make sure they had access to that black gold. All right, so we've got bad borders, we've got oil politics. Now we have to add the third layer, and this one is maybe the most intense. The emotional, the ideological core of the whole region's tensions, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what's so tough here is that you have two powerful, deeply held, and completely competing stories for the exact same piece of land. On one hand, after centuries of persecution, the Jewish people were desperate for a homeland, which the UN helps create as Israel in 1948. But on the other hand, the Palestinian Arabs were already living there, and after the war that followed, they were displaced, becoming refugees. And to make it all a million times worse, Britain had made conflicting promises to both sides. The whole situation just exploded immediately. As soon as Israel is created, its Arab neighbors attack. Israel wins that war, but in the process, it expands its territory and creates this massive Palestinian refugee crisis. And that just kicks off this brutal cycle of violence, occupation, and failed peace deals that is still going on today. It's like two people fighting over a single room, but they both have a key, and they're both absolutely convinced that their key is the only one that's real. This single conflict just electrifies everything else.
So you've got outside powers meddling all the time. But it's not just them. The Middle East has its own internal power struggles, its own Cold Wars, if you will, that add a whole other layer of crazy to the mix.
The main event right now, it's the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
And look, this is not just some political disagreement. This is a full-blown battle for who gets to be the top dog in the region, and it's fought along religious and ideological lines. You've got the Sunni monarchy in Saudi Arabia, which is buddies with the US, facing off against the Shia theocracy in Iran, which is very much anti-US. And how do they fight? Through proxy wars, meaning they fund and arm opposite sides in conflicts all over the place. In Yemen, in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, turning local fights into massive regional battlegrounds.
But even that internal rivalry is just part of the story. Because of the oil, its strategic location, and all these conflicts, the Middle East basically became a giant chessboard for global powers. And everybody wants a piece. Let's break it down. The US, it wants cheap oil, it wants military bases, and it wants to protect Israel. Russia, it wants its port in Syria and a way to push back against the West. Europe, it desperately wants stable energy and, frankly, fewer refugees. And China, it's all about energy security and getting its economic foot in the door. What you're seeing here is a geopolitical pressure cooker with way too many cooks in the kitchen. And all their competing interests, they just create more chaos, not less. So, here we are, 100 years later. And where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with an unfinished story. A story where every new problem is just piled right on top of that original, deeply flawed foundation. You can honestly think about it like a recipe for a century of conflict. Step 1, start with a terrible map. Just draw borders that completely ignore the people living there. Step 2, add oil, a ton of it, to make that terrible map incredibly valuable to the whole world. Step 3, mix in a core conflict that feels impossible to solve, like the one between Israelis and Palestinians. And for the final step, just fold in decades of local rivalries and global power games. See, each layer just makes the one underneath it that much worse. And that brings us right back to the original sin. Those pizza slice borders from 1916 are still haunting the region today. Think about it. The Kurds, 30 million people, have no country. They're spread across 4 different nations. The deep Shia-Sunni divide, it cuts right across these made-up borders. The whole system, the entire thing, is built on artificial lines that just don't match the people on the ground. And this right here is why this region will always matter. The world can change, technology can change, but the geography, that's permanent. Whoever has influence in the Middle East controls a huge slice of global oil, they control critical sea routes like the Suez Canal, and they have a hand in the heartland of 3 of the world's biggest religions. So, at the end of the day, what's the big takeaway? It's this. A century later, the entire world is still trying to clean up the mess and solve a puzzle that was made by 2 men who never saw the full picture and who never had to live with the consequences. They didn't get it then, and the real question is, what happens next? Can anyone see the full picture now?